In 1953, a small company in Hayward, California, did something no major beverage manufacturer had ever done. They put soda in a can. Not a cone top, not the bottle, a flat-top aluminum can. Lightweight, portable, disposable, the kind you crack open today without thinking twice. Within 15 years, that decision reshaped the entire American soft drink industry. By 1969, more than half of all soda sold in the United States came in cans. Coca-Cola followed. Pepsi followed. Every regional bottler in the country followed. The company that started it all was called Shasta. 3 years after that breakthrough, Shasta was sold to a conglomerate that made pantyhose and frozen cheesecake. Not because the soda failed, not because the company went bankrupt, not because Americans stopped drinking it. Shasta was sold because the people who owned it had stopped understanding what they had. But the real story of Shasta is not the story of a can. It is the story of a brand that invented the future of American soda 3 separate times, and never once received credit for any of it. Every week, we tell the stories behind the brands and the companies that shaped American life. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins not in a factory, not in a boardroom. It begins at the base of a volcano in Northern California in 1889. Siskiyou County sits in the far northern corner of California, where the state bleeds into Oregon, and the land turns from valley farmland into something older and harder. Forests, lava fields, and rising above all of it, Mount Shasta. A dormant stratovolcano standing 14,079 feet above sea level, visible for 100 miles in every direction. In 1889, this was not a place people came to build businesses. It was a place people passed through on their way somewhere else. The railroad had arrived a decade earlier, connecting the remote mountain country to San Francisco in the south and Portland in the north. A few settlers had stayed. A few entrepreneurs had looked at the land and asked whether anything here was worth selling. One thing was, beneath the base of Mount Shasta, natural springs pushed mineral-rich water up through layers of volcanic rock. The water emerged cold, clean, and faintly carbonated, effervescent by nature, without any industrial process, in an era when urban water supplies were contaminated, when cholera still moved through American cities. When doctors prescribed mineral water as medicine, that spring was worth real money. A group of investors saw it clearly. In December of 1889, they incorporated the Shasta Mineral Springs Company in Siskiyou County, California. Their business plan was straightforward: pump the water, bottle it in glass siphon containers, load it onto railroad cars, and sell it to hotels, health spas, and wealthy households along the West Coast. The logistics, however, were not straightforward. Glass bottles filled with water were heavy, fragile, and prone to contamination during transport. Metal freight cars transferred heat, odor, and trace minerals into any liquid that touched their walls. The founders solved this with the innovation that would define Shasta's engineering instinct for the next century. They lined the interior of their railroad freight cars with glass, creating sealed, thermally stable chambers that protected the water from the moment it left the spring to the moment it arrived at a bottling facility hundreds of miles away. It was an expensive solution. It was also the correct one. By the turn of the century, Shasta mineral water was flowing into San Francisco restaurants, Portland hotels, and private homes along the entire Pacific coast. In 1928, the company opened its third bottling facility and marked the occasion by changing its name, the Shasta Water Company, shedding mineral springs as its product line expanded beyond a single source. Then Prohibition ended everything the company thought it knew about its own market. From 1920 to 1933, the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages across the United States. For 13 years, Americans who wanted to drink socially turned to mixers, club soda, ginger ale, mineral water. Shasta's products were suddenly not a luxury, they were infrastructure. But 1933 brought repeal, and with it, a problem. Alcohol came back. Mineral water as a standalone product retreated. The mixer market contracted almost overnight. Shasta needed a new reason for Americans to buy their product. The year was 1931, 2 years before repeal, when the writing was already on the wall, and the United States was in the grip of the Great Depression. Unemployment had reached 24%. Families across the country were cutting every expense that wasn't essential. Coca-Cola cost more than many households could justify. A trip to the drugstore fountain was a small luxury, but a luxury nonetheless. Shasta's answer was the Shasta Pale Dry Ginger Ale, priced below Coca-Cola, bottled for home consumption rather than fountain service, marketed not as a treat, but as an everyday beverage a working family could afford to keep in the house. The ginger ale appealed to consumers who needed a mixer for home cocktails, yes, but it also appealed to families who simply wanted something cold and flavorful that wasn't water. It sold, not in enormous quantities. Shasta was still a regional company, still operating primarily in California markets, but it sold steadily, through the worst economic collapse in American history, to exactly the kind of customer Shasta would spend the next 5 decades trying to reach. The customer who wanted something good and couldn't afford to pay full price for it. That customer, overlooked, underserved, and thirsty, was about to become the most important person into the American beverage industry. Shasta just had to figure out how to reach them at scale. The answer would come in the 1950s, and it would change everything. In 1953, Shasta made 3 decisions in the same year. Any one of them would have been significant. Together, they rewrote the rules of the American soft drink industry. The first decision was the can. Until 1953, soda came in glass. Heavy, returnable glass bottles that required a deposit, a trip back to the store, and an entire reverse logistics system to collect, clean, and refill. The bottle was not just packaging, it was infrastructure, and it locked every regional bottler in America into a distribution model that favored whoever already had the most trucks, the most routes, and the most established relationships with fountain operators. Shasta looked at that system and walked away from it. Working with flat-top aluminum can technology that had been developed primarily for the beer industry, Shasta became the first major soft drink company to commit fully to canned soda. Not as an experiment, not as a regional test, as the primary packaging format going forward. The flat-top can, a steel cylinder with a smooth, sealed lid, opened with a separate church key tool, was lighter than glass, cheaper to ship, and required no return deposit. For a family driving to a picnic, it fit in a cooler without risk of breakage. For a grocery store, it stacked cleanly on a shelf without the complexity of bottle deposit accounting. For Shasta, it meant a fundamental cost advantage over every competitor still married to glass. The industry watched. Then the industry followed. Soda sold in cans represented roughly 1% of total American soft drink volume in 1950. By the end of the 1960s, that number had crossed 50%. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, every regional bottler in the country eventually made the transition. The infrastructure of the modern American convenience store, the cold case full of cans, traces its origin to that decision made by a mid-sized California water company in 1953. The second decision was the diet soda. Americans in 1953 had no mainstream low-calorie soft drink option. Sugar was sugar. A 12-ounce Coca-Cola carried roughly 140 calories, and no alternative existed for anyone. Diabetics, weight-conscious women, anyone on a medically restricted diet who wanted the experience of soda without the sugar load. Shasta introduced its first low-calorie line the same year it launched the can. The sweetener was saccharin, a compound that had been known since the 1870s but never deployed at consumer scale in a carbonated beverage sold through mainstream grocery channels. The taste was imperfect. Early saccharin-sweetened sodas carried a distinct metallic finish that loyal Shasta drinkers would debate for decades. But the category was real. The need was real. A generation of American women, The primary household grocery shoppers of the 1950s noticed the option on the shelf and reached for it. Coca-Cola would not launch Tab, its first Diet Cola, until 1963. Pepsi would follow with Diet Pepsi in 1964. Shasta had been selling low-calorie soda for a full decade before either competitor entered the space. The third decision was where they sold it. In 1953, the dominant model for soda distribution in America ran through independent bottlers with exclusive territorial franchises. Coca-Cola did not sell directly to grocery stores. It sold to a bottler, who sold to a retailer, who sold to a consumer. Each step in that chain added cost, added delay, and added a layer of control that Coke and Pepsi used to lock out smaller competitors. Shasta cut the chain entirely by establishing direct wholesale relationships with grocery store buyers, bypassing the franchise bottler system altogether. Shasta put its products on supermarket shelves at a price point that the franchise system structurally could not match. No middleman markup, no territorial bottler taking a margin. Shasta negotiated directly, delivered directly, and priced directly. The result was visible on every grocery store shelf in California by the late 1950s. A 12-pack of Shasta in multiple flavors, priced below a 12-pack of Coca-Cola in a single flavor, for a working family, a factory worker in Sacramento, a railroad employee in Fresno, a teacher in San Diego. The math was not complicated. 20 cents a can for Shasta, more for everything else. And Shasta did not ask the consumer to settle, because the fourth pillar of Shasta's breakthrough was the one that made the price irrelevant as a sacrifice: flavor. While Coca-Cola guarded one formula and Pepsi guarded another, Shasta built an expanding library: root beer, orange, cherry cola, lemon lime, grape, strawberry, grapefruit, and eventually, in the early 1970s, a flavor called Tiki Punch, packaged in a vivid hot pink can that would become one of the most recognizable soda images of an entire American decade. The philosophy behind the flavor expansion was domestic and practical. A family of four rarely agreed on a single flavor: a mother who wanted diet ginger ale, a father who wanted cola, a daughter who wanted orange, a son who wanted root beer. Shasta could satisfy all of them in a single grocery run. Coca-Cola could not. Pepsi could not. One case of Shasta, bought at a price a working family could absorb, covered the entire household. That was not a marketing slogan. It was a structural advantage that no amount of advertising budget could replicate. By the close of the 1950s, Shasta had built something that the larger players had not anticipated: loyalty rooted not in brand aspiration, but in household utility. Families did not drink Shasta because it made them feel sophisticated. They drank Shasta because it made sense. In the beverage business, that kind of loyalty is quieter than the kind built on advertising. It is also, as Shasta was about to discover, far more fragile. By 1960, Shasta had accomplished something quietly remarkable. Without a celebrity spokesperson, without a national advertising campaign, without a single franchise bottler or exclusive territorial agreement, a water company from the base of a California volcano had built the dominant value soda brand across the entire western United States. The shelves told the story. In California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and Arizona, Shasta occupied more supermarket real estate than any competitor in the value segment. Not a regional curiosity, not a store brand. A named, recognized product that American families reached for by habit, week after week, on every grocery run. But Shasta had a problem. The Kelkrina that its own success had obscured. Utility is not identity. Families bought Shasta because it made sense. They did not yet love Shasta the way a Chicago steelworker loved Schlitz, or the way a Brooklyn longshoreman loved Rheingold. Shasta was in the refrigerator. It was not yet in the culture. And in the American consumer market of the 1960s, the distance between those two positions was the difference between a brand that endures and a brand that gets sold. The people running Shasta in the early 1960s understood this, and so they went to television. The late 1960s marked the beginning of Shasta's most aggressive advertising era, a sustained campaign of humorous, high-energy television commercials that ran in heavy rotation across West Coast markets and, increasingly, nationally. The spots were not sophisticated by Madison Avenue standards. They were not trying to be. They were loud, colorful, and relentlessly focused on one message. Shasta has more flavors, costs less, and comes in a can. That message, delivered with enough frequency and enough personality, began to work. By the early 1970s, Shasta had embedded itself into a specific corner of American domestic life. Not bars, not restaurants, not vending machines, but the backyard, the kitchen table, the cooler at the Little League game, the card table at the church picnic. Shasta was the soda that appeared when a family gathered, when neighbors came over, when there were enough people present that you needed more than one flavor. And in 1972, Shasta found the voice that would define the brand for an entire generation of American children. The commercial aired on Saturday morning television, NBC, October 1972, slotted between cartoon programming. It opened on an animated sequence, a rotund, jovial figure moving to the sound of a walking bass line. Then the music changed. Drums, a marching rhythm, cartoon children filing across the screen in a parade singing in unison. Shasta, the pop that hasta. The narrator's voice cut through. Warm, authoritative, familiar. It belonged to Tom Bosley, an actor then building the television career that would make him synonymous with American fatherhood as Howard Cunningham on Happy Days. His closing line landed with the particular gentleness of someone who had earned your trust before the commercial began. So many bubbles, it'll tickle your nose. It was not a complex piece of advertising. It did not need to be. Saturday morning in 1972, E2 meant 12 million American children sitting 18 inches from a television set, eating cereal, watching cartoons, absorbing everything the screen told them to want. Shasta told them to want something cold, sweet, bubbly, and available in enough flavors that their parents could not say no. The strategy worked with a precision that Shasta's competitors did not fully appreciate until it was already done. Those children, born between 1962 and 1968, the tail end of the baby boom, were making grocery requests by 1973. Their parents, already predisposed to Shasta's price point, found the decision easy. Shasta Tiki Punch arrived in this same window. The flavor itself, tropical, sweet, faintly pineapple adjacent, was less important than the can. Hot pink. Unmistakable at 20 feet. In an era when soda packaging was predominantly red, white, and brown, a hot pink can in a cooler full of ice announced itself with a confidence that advertising copy could not manufacture. For an entire generation of American children growing up in the suburban West, California backyards, Nevada apartment pools, Arizona summer afternoons, Tiki Punch was not a flavor. It was a season. The moment a parent cracked that pink can open at the edge of a swimming pool, it was summer. Fully, irreversibly summer. That is not nostalgia speaking. That is the specific alchemy that separates a beverage brand from a beverage product. Shasta, for one specific demographic in one specific decade, achieved it. And in 1977, Shasta found a face to put on it. Barry Williams, Greg Brady, the oldest son of America's most famous blended family, a figure who had spent 6 seasons representing the wholesome, slightly awkward optimism of suburban American life, appeared in a Shasta Orange commercial dressed in a suit of medieval armor. The narration was provided by Casey Kasem, the voice of American Top 40 Radio, a man whose authority over popular culture in 1977 was absolute. The commercial aired in August of that year. It was absurdist, deliberate, self-aware in the way that mid-1970s advertising occasionally allowed itself to be. Greg Brady in armor, Casey Kasem narrating, orange soda. The combination should not have worked. It worked because the genius of Shasta's advertising in this period was not sophistication. It was recognition. Every commercial Shasta made in the 1970s spoke directly to the person who had already bought a 12-pack that week. It confirmed the decision they had already made. It told them, "You chose correctly. This is the fun one. This is the smart one. This is the one your kids will remember." By the late 1970s, Shasta had built something that no balance sheet fully captured, a brand that 3 generations of the same American family could recognize simultaneously. The grandfather who had bought ginger ale during the Depression, the mother who had switched to Diet Shasta in the early 1960s, the child who had watched Tom Bosley on Saturday morning and demanded tiki punch at every birthday party since. One brand, 3 generations, one grocery store shelf. That was the peak, and it was in the middle of the that peak. While the commercials were running and the pink cans were moving and a generation of American children were growing up believing that summer tasted like tiki punch, that the forces gathering against Shasta were already in motion. In 1983, Shasta was expanding, not consolidating, not defending, expanding, pushing east, increasing advertising spend, chasing national relevance with the confidence of a brand that had spent 3 decades winning on its own terms. The Western United States was already Shasta's. The question was whether the rest of the country could be brought along. The campaign that emerged from that ambition became the most culturally durable thing Shasta ever produced. Not the can, not the diet soda, not Tiki Punch, a jingle. Shasta's ad agency that year hired a young musician named Al Jurgensen to write and perform the commercial's centerpiece song. Jurgensen was 24 years old, based in Chicago, and had released one synth-pop album on a small independent label. He was not famous. He was not expensive. He was exactly what a mid-budget national advertising campaign needed: talented, hungry, and available. What he wrote was not subtle. "Don't give me that so-so soda, the same old cola. I want a rock and rolla. I want a pop. I want a Shasta." The production was saturated with the sonic texture of 1983. Synthesizers layered over a driving rhythm, electronic voices multiplying the hook, a melodic climb on the word pop that lodged itself in the listener's memory with the efficiency of a well-placed nail. The visuals matched. Neon colors, geometric animation, dancing penguins in sunglasses, moving against a keyboard that appeared to play itself. It ran in multiple versions through 1984. Beach spots, pool spots, animated sequences. Each iteration repackaged the same hook for a different setting. A different 30 seconds, the same irresistible last line. The campaign locked Shasta into the consciousness of an entire generation of American children born in the mid-1970s, the cohort that would eventually be labeled Generation X. They did not know Al Jurgensen's name. They did not know that the man singing about wanting a Shasta would spend the following decade building one of the most abrasive and influential industrial metal bands in American music history. Ministry, the band Jurgensen founded in the years immediately following the Shasta campaign, would release records that sounded nothing like Dancing Penguins. Twitch, the land of rape and honey. Psalm 69, music that defined the darkest register of 1980s and 1990s alternative culture. The distance between I Wanna Pop and Psalm 69 is one of the more improbable trajectories in American music history, but in 1983, none of that existed yet. There was only the jingle, the neon, the penguins, and a generation of children who absorbed it completely. The proof arrived 20 years later in 2002, when director M. Night Shyamalan inserted the original I Wanna Pop television spot into the background of a scene in his science fiction film Signs. Not as a joke, not as parody, as a genuine artifact of American domestic life. The kind of image that places a scene in a specific time, a specific living room, a specific childhood. Shyamalan did not need to explain the reference. His audience recognized it instantly. That is what cultural penetration looks like, measured 2 decades after the fact. By the mid-1980s, Shasta had achieved something that its founders, bottling mineral water in glass siphon containers on the slopes of a California volcano, could not have imagined. The brand was present in supermarkets across the country. Its diet line had pioneered a category that Coca-Cola and Pepsi now dominated. Its can format had become the universal standard for the entire industry. Its advertising had reached 3 consecutive generations of American consumers. The numbers reflected it. Shasta held the dominant position in the value soda segment across the western United States with meaningful penetration into Midwest grocery chains, dozens of flavors, millions of cases shipped annually, a brand recognition rate among American consumers over 40 that rivaled brands with 10 times the advertising budget. At its peak, Shasta was not competing with Coca-Cola for prestige. It was competing for something more durable. The weekly grocery decision made by a parent with a budget, a cooler to fill, and children with opinions. In that specific contest, for that specific consumer, Shasta won more often than anyone outside the industry fully appreciated. One in every grocery cart heading toward the soda aisle in a California, Oregon, or Washington supermarket during the summer of 1984 carried a case of Shasta. Root beer, orange, cherry cola, tiki punch. The pink can still moving faster than almost anything else on the shelf. It was the top of the arc, and arcs, by definition, do not hold. What happened next was not a single catastrophic failure. There was no contamination scandal, no regulatory collapse, no founder's death that destabilized the company overnight. What happened to Shasta was slower, quieter, and in many ways more instructive than a dramatic collapse. It was the story of the brand that had been sold to people who did not understand what they had bought, and of an industry that had learned everything Shasta taught, and then used those lessons to bury it. That story had already begun. It had begun, in fact, 17 years earlier. In 1966, the year a food conglomerate in Chicago decided that a California soda company would make a useful addition to its portfolio. The year Shasta stopped belonging to itself. In 1966, Consolidated Foods Corporation purchased Shasta. The name Consolidated Foods meant little to most Americans. That was by design. Consolidated Foods was not a brand. In Beerzabates, it was a holding structure, a Chicago-based conglomerate that had spent the post-war decades acquiring consumer goods companies the way a collector acquires objects, systematically, opportunistically, and without particular attachment to what any individual piece actually was. By 1966, Consolidated Foods owned Electrolux vacuum cleaners, Hanes Hosiery, Sara Lee baked goods, and a collection of food processing and distribution businesses spanning 3 continents. The company would eventually rename itself Sara Lee Corporation in 1985, choosing its most recognizable brand as the public face of an empire built on acquisition. Shasta fit the portfolio as a cash-generating consumer product with established distribution and low capital requirements. It was not acquired because anyone at Consolidated Foods loved soda. It was acquired because the numbers worked and the price was right. That distinction between ownership rooted in understanding and ownership rooted in accounting would determine everything that followed. The first thing Consolidated Foods did was rename the company Shasta Beverages, a corporate suffix added to signal professional management and institutional seriousness. The second thing they did was rationalize the operation, standardizing production, optimizing margins, treating the brand's value as a fixed asset to be managed rather than a living thing to be cultivated. What they did not do was ask why Shasta had won. The answer, had anyone inside Consolidated Foods pursued it, was uncomfortable. Shasta had won because it moved faster than its competitors. It had seen the can before Coke saw it. It had seen diet soda before Pepsi saw it. It had seen direct grocery distribution before either of them saw it. Shasta's competitive advantage was not its formula, not its price, not even its flavor variety. Its competitive advantage was institutional speed. The willingness of a smaller, hungrier company to take structural risks that larger, more cautious competitors would not. Consolidated Foods was not a smaller, hungrier company. Meanwhile, the competitors Shasta had outmaneuvered were arriving. Coca-Cola had launched Tab in 1963, 3 years before the acquisition, 1 decade after Shasta had introduced low-calorie soda to American supermarkets. Tab was inferior to Shasta's diet line in several measurable ways. It used cyclamates as a sweetener, which the FDA would ban in 1969 for a potential link to cancer, forcing a reformulation that further damaged the product's reputation. But Coca-Cola spent money on Tab that Shasta could not match. Television, print, sponsorships. The Coca-Cola marketing apparatus turned Tab into a cultural phenomenon. Despite its flaws, Diet Pepsi followed in 1964. Same dynamic. Pepsi's version of Diet Cola was not meaningfully better than what Shasta had been selling for 11 years. But Pepsi's advertising budget ensured that Diet Pepsi became the reference point for diet soda in American supermarkets, not Shasta. The pattern was consistent and brutal. Shasta pioneered, the major players followed, and then the major players' marketing budgets rewrote the history of who had arrived first. By the early 1970s, the category Shasta had created, low-calorie carbonated soft drinks, was dominated by brands that had not existed when Shasta introduced the concept. The can format Shasta had pioneered was now universal, which meant it was no longer an advantage. The direct-to-grocer distribution model Shasta had invented was now standard industry practice. Every structural advantage Shasta had built was gone, copied, absorbed, and scaled by competitors with resources Shasta could not match. What remained was the price. And in the American consumer market, price alone is a foundation that does not hold. The second ownership transfer came in 1985. Sara Lee, by then operating under that name, sold Shasta Beverages to National Beverage Corporation, a newly formed holding company incorporated in Delaware and headquartered in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. National Beverage had been assembled by a businessman named Nick Caparella, who also acquired Faygo, a Detroit-based value soda brand with a loyal Midwest following, in the same period. The logic of the acquisition was straightforward. Shasta and Faygo together would give National Beverage dominant coverage of the American value soda segment, with Shasta serving the West and Faygo serving the East. 2 regional brands, managed under one holding structure, competing on price, in the segment that Coca-Cola and Pepsi had largely vacated. It was a rational business decision. It was also the moment Shasta ceased to be a brand with a trajectory and became a brand with a position. A fixed, defended, slowly shrinking position at the bottom of the grocery store soda aisle. The 1980s brought a structural shift that no value soda brand was equipped to survive intact. The American beverage market fragmented in ways that the industry had not anticipated. Snapple arrived in 1972 and began its national expansion through the 1980s, pulling consumers toward premium, non-carbonated alternatives. Perrier and Evian established sparkling and still water as aspirational categories. Sports drinks, Gatorade had launched in 1965 but reached mass market scale in the 1980s, captured the active consumer demographic entirely. The baby boomers, who had grown up drinking Shasta from pink cans at the edge of swimming pools, were now 35 years old. They had incomes their parents had not had. They had opinions about what their beverage choices said about them. And what a 12-pack of value soda said about them was a thing they were no longer willing to broadcast. Shasta did not lose those consumers to Coca-Cola. It lost them to a category that had not existed when Shasta was built. The premium non-soda beverage, the drink that cost more and signaled more and satisfied something that carbonated sugar water, however cheap, however varied, however pink, could no longer satisfy. The grocery store told the story in numbers that required no interpretation. Shelf space allocated to Shasta in California supermarkets, its home territory. The region it had dominated since the 1950s, contracted through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic reallocation, but steadily. One facing removed here, one SKU discontinued there. The kind of erosion that does not make headlines, but shows up in quarterly distribution reports with a consistency that becomes impossible to ignore. National Beverage responded with what the playbook suggested: new flavors, updated packaging, periodic advertising pushes. In 2003, Shasta launched Shasta Shorts, 8-ounce cans in candy-inspired flavors, cotton candy, bubble gum, red grape stain, targeted at children. The line ran until 2006 and was discontinued. None of it reversed the underlying trajectory. The demographic that remembered Shasta with genuine affection was aging. The demographic that might have built a new relationship with the brand was not given a reason to. Between those two facts was a gap that neither flavor variety nor price could bridge. No single plant closed dramatically. No founder died in a way that made the news. No formula was changed in a boardroom and rejected by loyal drinkers overnight. Shasta simply contracted, year by year, shelf by shelf, until the brand that had invented the American soda can, pioneered the diet soft drink, and built the direct-to-grocer distribution model that the entire industry now runs on, occupied the bottom shelf. The last facing, the lowest price, no ceremony, no announcement, still there, just smaller than anyone remembered. Shasta still exists. That is not a triumphant statement. It is simply a fact, one that requires some context to understand fully. In 2026, Shasta Beverages operates as a subsidiary of National Beverage Corporation, headquartered in Plantation, Florida. Its products are manufactured at regional facilities and distributed primarily through value retail channels: Dollar General, Walmart, Food 4less, the discount grocery chains that serve the segment of the American consumer market that Shasta has occupied, without interruption, for the better part of 4 decades. The flavor count remains extraordinary. More than 30 varieties: Shasta Cola, Shasta Orange, Shasta Ginger Ale, Shasta Root Beer, Tiki Punch, Grapefruit Zazz, Dr. Shasta, diet variants of most of the above. No mainstream soda brand in America offers comparable variety at comparable price. That was true in 1965. It remains true today. But the brand's resurrection, if it can be called that, is not the story of a company that fought its way back. It is the story of a company that never fully left, surviving in the space that larger competitors chose not to contest, selling to the consumer that premium brands stopped speaking to somewhere around 1987. National Beverage did not revive Shasta. It maintained Shasta, kept the lights on, kept the flavors flowing, kept the price where the price had always been. Survival without narrative is its own kind of fate. The more vivid afterlife of Shasta exists not on grocery shelves, but in the secondary market for American consumer nostalgia. A market that turns out to be substantial, specific, and almost entirely invisible to the mainstream beverage industry. Vintage Shasta cans from the 1950s through the 1970s are among the more actively traded items in the American soda can collecting community. Flat-top cans from the early 1950s, the original format that Shasta pioneered, command significant premiums among serious collectors, particularly unopened examples in original condition. Cone-top variants from the transitional period sell for more. Point-of-sale materials, the cardboard displays, the shelf talkers, the promotional signage from Shasta's peak grocery store presence in the 1960s and 1970s appear regularly on eBay and at antique shows, priced between $40 and several $100s depending on condition and rarity. Tiki Punch cans from the early 1970s, the hot pink ones, the ones that defined summer for an entire cohort of American children, are among the most requested items in vintage soda can groups on Facebook, where tens of thousands of collectors share finds, discuss provenance, and occasionally argue with considerable passion about which regional variant of a 1968 Shasta Orange label is the more correct one. These are not casual hobbyists. They are people for whom a specific can represent a specific memory, a backyard, a summer, a version of American domestic life that the can itself somehow contains and preserves. The object is not the point. The object is a door. Working Shasta neon signs from the 1960s and early 1970s, the kind that hung in diners and small grocery stores across California, sell for $200 to $600 when they surface in good condition. They move within days of listing. The buyers are not decorators. They are people who saw that sign as children and want to see it again. There is also the matter of what Shasta still offers that no other brand can replicate. Not nostalgia. Something more practical. A family with three children, each with a different preference. A grocery budget that does not accommodate premium pricing. And a summer afternoon to fill. That family's problem has one solution that it has had since 1965. One case. Multiple flavors. A price that does not require a decision. Shasta's 30-flavor lineup is not a marketing strategy. It is an answer to a domestic reality that has not changed in 60 years. The children are different. The pool is different. The summer is different. The answer is the same. At the original site of the Shasta Mineral Springs Company, the base of Mount Shasta in Siskiyou County, California, the natural springs still flow, cold water, faintly mineralized, pushing up through volcanic rock the same way it has for centuries. The resort that surrounded them in 1889 is long gone. The glass-lined railroad cars are gone. The bottling operation that turned spring water into a West Coast luxury product is gone. The springs remain. No one bottles them commercially anymore. And then there is Al Jorgensen, the young musician who wrote I Wanna Pop for a Shasta commercial in 1983, 24 years old, unknown, paid to make a jingle for a mid-budget soda campaign, went on to found Ministry, the Chicago-based band that would spend the following 3 decades as one of the defining forces in American industrial metal, the land of rape and honey. Psalm 69. Records that sound nothing like Dancing Penguins. Music built from distortion and hostility, and a fury that could not be further in spirit from the neon-bright optimism of a Shasta pool spot. Jorgensen has never hidden the connection. In interviews over the years, he has acknowledged the jingle with the particular equanimity of someone who has made peace with a strange biographical fact. He needed the work. Shasta needed the song. The transaction was complete. What neither party anticipated was that the jingle would outlast almost everything else either of them produced in that decade. M. Night Shyamalan placed the original I Wanna Pop television spot in the background of a scene in Signs. Released in 2002, not as comedy, not as irony, but as a genuine period marker, a piece of American domestic television that placed the scene in a specific time and a specific living room without requiring a single word of explanation. The audience recognized it. 2 decades after it aired, a jingle written by a future industrial metal pioneer for a value soda brand from Northern California still functioned as a shared cultural reference for an entire generation of Americans. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the definition of cultural penetration. The moment an advertisement stops being an advertisement and becomes a memory. Shasta's arc, viewed from sufficient distance, is the story of what American consumer culture does with innovation it cannot immediately monetize at scale. The can, the diet soda, the direct grocery channel. 3 structural changes to the American beverage industry, each pioneered by a company that lacked the resources to defend what it had created. Coca-Cola and Pepsi did not invent those things. They perfected them. They scaled them. They spent enough money to ensure that their names became synonymous with innovations they had not originated. That is not cynicism. That is the mechanism. In the American market, the inventor and the beneficiary of an invention are frequently different entities. The inventor moves first because it has nothing to lose. The beneficiary arrives second, with more capital and more patience, and takes what the inventor proved was possible. Shasta proved that Americans would buy soda in cans. Coca-Cola proved it to the entire world. Shasta proved that Americans wanted low-calorie soda. Diet Coke became the best-selling diet beverage in human history. Shasta proved that a direct-to-grocer distribution model could work at regional scale. The entire modern beverage industry runs on a version of that model today. The company that proved all three of those things now sells 30 flavors of soda from the bottom shelf of a Dollar General in Bakersfield, California. And somewhere in that Bakersfield store, on a Tuesday afternoon in August, a parent reaches past the Coca-Cola and past the Pepsi and picks up a 12-pack of Shasta. Root beer, orange, tiki punch, one of each, because the kids can't agree, and the budget is what it is. And this is the answer that has always worked. The can is cold. The choice is easy. The pink one disappears first. It always does.